In the winter of 1885, Eleanor Hayes thought she understood loneliness. The recently widowed schoolteacher had prepared herself for a solitary season in Montana Territory's harsh mountains, where neighbors had turned inward and the schoolhouse doors had closed for good. Her husband's sudden passing left her with little more than a drafty homestead and dwindling supplies, facing the brutal snowstorms that could claim lives as easily as they buried hopes. But when Colt McCallister rode into town with a wagon full of provisions and an offer that seemed too generous to trust, Eleanor discovered that survival sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. This mysterious cowboy carried his own invisible wounds, and what began as a simple arrangement, shelter for supplies, would grow into something neither had dared to hope for. Yet in a town where whispers travel faster than prairie wind, their fragile connection would face trials that winter storms couldn't match. Would the secrets from Colt's past destroy the one chance Eleanor had at healing her broken heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a shroud, and Eleanor Hayes stood at her kitchen window, watching the last of autumn's warmth surrender to winter's advance. The glass was cold against her fingertips, and beyond it, the Montana Territory stretched endlessly, rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, their leaves now fallen and scattered like memories across the frozen ground. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, the same shawl Thomas had brought her from Denver 3 winters past, when hope still lived in this house and laughter still echoed from the schoolroom down the hill. The schoolhouse stood empty now, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The Territorial Education Board had closed it indefinitely after enrollment dropped to just 7 children, and those 7 had scattered to distant relatives or followed their families to warmer territories where winter didn't bite quite so hard. Eleanor's position as schoolmom had evaporated with the children's departure, leaving her with little more than her late husband's savings and the stubborn determination that had carried her through 34 years of prairie life. Thomas had been gone 4 months now. The consumption took him slowly, then all at once, the way such things do when a man's lungs finally surrender to the dust and cold of a lifetime spent working the land. She remembered his last coherent words, whispered through cracked lips as autumn's first snow dusted the windowsill. "Promise me you'll find your way through this winter, Ellie. Promise me you won't just survive it, you'll live through it." She'd made that promise, though now, watching the grey clouds gather above the mountain peaks, she wondered what living truly meant when you're left to do it alone. The sound of boots on her front porch broke through her reverie. Eleanor smoothed her dark hair, still thick at 34, though now touched with premature silver at the temples, and opened the door to find Margaret Hendricks standing there with a covered dish and concern etched across her weathered face. "Morning, Eleanor," Margaret said, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "Brought you some of that cornbread you always favored. Figured you might not be doing much baking these days." Eleanor accepted the offering with a grateful smile, though both women knew the gesture carried weight beyond simple neighborly kindness. In a territory where survival often depended on community support, Margaret's visits had become a lifeline, not just for the food and supplies, but for the human connection that kept Eleanor tethered to the world beyond her grief. "You're too good to me, Margaret. Would you like to come in for coffee? I've got a fresh pot brewing." Margaret stepped inside, her keen eyes taking in the tidy but lonely interior of the Hayes homestead. The furniture remained exactly as Thomas had left it, his reading chair by the fireplace, his pipe still resting on the mantel, his coat hanging on the hook by the door as if he might return from the fields at any moment. Eleanor had found comfort in the preservation of these details, though she noticed how Margaret's gaze lingered on them with a mixture of understanding and concern. "Eleanor, honey," Margaret began carefully as they settled at the kitchen table. With steaming cups, I know it's not my place to say, but folks in town are starting to worry about you out here all alone. Winter's coming on hard, and with the schoolhouse closed, I'll manage." Eleanor replied, perhaps too quickly. "Thomas left me enough to get through the cold months, and I've got the garden vegetables stored away. The chickens are still laying, and there's plenty of firewood." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "It's not just about supplies, dear. It's about having someone to look after you, someone to help if things go wrong. What if you take sick? What if the roof gives way under the snow load? What if I can't keep living in fear of every possibility?" Eleanor interrupted gently. "Thomas wouldn't want me to make decisions based on what might happen. He'd want me to trust in my own strength." The older woman reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "He would. You're right about that. Thomas always said you had more grit than most men he knew, but he also would have wanted you to accept help when it's offered." Eleanor studied her friend's face, recognizing the careful way Margaret was approaching some larger point. "What kind of help are we talking about?" "Well, there's the Jameson family over in Copper Creek. They've got room in their house, and Sarah Jameson could use help with the children's lessons. They'd take you in for the winter, give you a place to stay and something useful to do." The suggestion settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor appreciated the kindness behind the offer, but the thought of leaving her home, the place where she and Thomas had built their life together, felt like abandoning the last tangible connection to everything she'd lost. "I appreciate the thought, Margaret, I truly do, but this is my home. These are my memories. I can't just pack them up and carry them to someone else's parlor." Margaret sighed, though not unkindly. "I understand the sentiment, honey, but memories don't keep you warm at night. They don't split firewood or mend a broken window when the wind comes howling through the valley." Eleanor rose and walked back to the window, watching the wind bend the bare branches of the cottonwood tree Thomas had planted the year they married. "Maybe that's something I need to learn to do for myself." "You're a schoolteacher, Eleanor, not a frontiersman. There's no shame in admitting you need help. There's no shame in learning new skills either," Eleanor replied, turning back to face her friend. "Thomas taught me to shoot straight and true. He showed me how to preserve meat and how to read the weather signs. I may not be a frontiersman, but I'm not helpless either." Margaret finished her coffee and stood, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "I won't argue with you, dear. You've always been as stubborn as a Missouri mule, and I suppose that's part of what will get you through this. But promise me you'll think about what I've said, and promise me you'll send word if you need anything at all." Eleanor embraced her friend, feeling the strength and warmth of someone who'd weathered her own share of prairie hardships. "I promise, and Margaret, thank you for caring enough to worry about me. It means more than you know." After Margaret left, Eleanor returned to her window vigil, watching the afternoon light fade behind the mountains. The house felt quiet in a way that went beyond simple silence. It felt suspended, as if waiting for something to break the spell of mourning that had settled over every room like dust. She thought about Thomas's promise, about the difference between surviving and living. Surviving was what she'd been doing these past 4 months, going through the motions of daily life without really engaging with it. Living would require something more, something she wasn't sure she was ready to give. But as the first snowflakes began to fall, dusting the windowsill where Thomas had drawn his final breath, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was a recognition that winter would pass, as it always did, and she would still be here when it did. The question was, what kind of person she'd be when spring returned to the valley. She touched the wedding ring on her finger, the simple gold band that had circled her finger for 12 years. Thomas had placed it there with trembling hands and a heart full of dreams they'd barely begun to realize. Now it felt like both anchor and weight, a reminder of love that couldn't be replaced, but also a question about what love might look like in a life that had to continue without him. The snow was falling harder now, and Eleanor began her evening. routine of banking the fire and checking the windows for drafts. Tomorrow she would need to bring in more firewood, and there were still vegetables in the garden that needed harvesting before the ground froze solid. These practical concerns grounded her, gave her immediate purpose beyond the larger questions. That seemed to have no answers. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about Margaret's words, about the difference between stubborn independence and foolish pride. She'd always been self-reliant, but she'd also always had Thomas as a partner in that self-reliance. Now she would discover what she was truly capable of on her own. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. Eleanor pulled her quilts closer and listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling for the night. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lonesome call of a coyote, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone in answering it. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of Thomas and memories of better times. But when morning came, Eleanor woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the schoolhouse closed. There was work to be done, a winter to prepare for, and a promise to keep. Whatever came next, she would meet it with the strength Thomas had always believed she possessed. The storm arrived 3 days later with the fury of a wild animal, driving snow sideways across the valley and piling drifts against Eleanor's door until she could barely push it open. She'd spent the morning battling the wind to secure the chicken coop and bring in the last of the firewood. Her hands numb despite her thick gloves, and her face stinging from the ice crystals that seemed to find every gap in her woolen scarf. By afternoon, the world had disappeared behind a curtain of white. Eleanor could barely see the barn from her kitchen window, and the familiar landmarks of her property had vanished into the swirling chaos. She'd weathered plenty of Montana storms, but this one felt different, angrier somehow, as if winter had decided to announce its arrival with particular violence. She was adding wood to the fire when she heard it, the distant sound of a horse's whinny, barely audible above the wind's howl. Eleanor paused, poker in hand, straining to listen. There it was again, closer now, accompanied by the creak of wagon wheels and a man's voice calling out words she couldn't quite make out. Whoever was out there in this weather was either very brave or very foolish. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's rifle. From above the mantel, she'd grown comfortable with its weight these past months and made her way to the front window. Through the driving snow, she could make out the shadowy outline of a wagon and team, struggling through the drifts toward her house. The driver was hunched forward against the storm, his hat pulled low and a thick coat wrapped around his shoulders. As the wagon drew closer, Eleanor could see it was loaded with supplies, covered by a heavy canvas tarp that snapped and billowed in the wind. The horses were laboring hard, their breath forming clouds that were immediately torn away by the gusting air. Eleanor watched as the stranger guided his team toward her barn, clearly familiar with the layout of frontier homesteads. He swung down from the wagon seat with practiced ease, his movements confident despite the brutal conditions. Even through the storm, she could tell he was a tall man, built for the kind of work that required both strength and endurance. She was debating whether to open the door when he appeared on her porch, snow clinging to his coat and hat. His knock was firm but respectful, the kind of knock that asked for help without demanding it. Eleanor kept the rifle in her hands, but out of immediate sight as she cracked the door open. The man who stood there was perhaps 40 years old, with weathered features and steady grey eyes that held no threat, only the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a long battle with the elements. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, despite the wind trying to tear it from his head. "I'm sorry to trouble you, especially in weather like this. Name's Colt McCallister. I was hoping to make it to town before the storm hit, but this one came on faster than expected." Eleanor studied his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors, and the careful way he kept his distance from her door. There was something in his manner that suggested both strength and gentleness, a combination that reminded her painfully of Thomas. A town still 5 miles through the pass, she said, having to raise her voice above the wind. You'll never make it in this weather, not with a loaded wagon. No, ma'am. I don't expect I will. He glanced back at his struggling horses, their coats already thick with snow. I was wondering if I might be able to shelter my animals in your barn for the night. I've got supplies in the wagon, food, medicine, winter goods bound for the mercantile. I'd be happy to share whatever you might need in exchange for the shelter. Eleanor felt a flutter of something that might have been relief. Her own supplies were adequate, but not abundant, and the offer of additional provisions was tempting. But more than that, there was something about this man's respectful approach that eased her natural caution. "What kind of supplies?" she asked. Colt gestured toward the wagon, though the wind made conversation difficult. "Flour, sugar, canned goods, lamp oil, medical supplies, warm clothing. I run goods between the railroad depot and the smaller settlements that can't always make the trip themselves. A merchant, then, or at least someone who understood the needs of isolated communities." Eleanor made her decision, stepping back from the door. "Bring your wagon around to the barn. There's room for your horses and shelter from the wind. We can talk more once you're out of this storm." Relief flickered across Colt's face. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm obliged." Eleanor watched from her window as he battled the elements to move his wagon. His movements efficient despite the difficult conditions. She found herself noting the gentle way he handled his horses, speaking to them in low, calming tones as he guided them into the barn's shelter. 20 minutes later, he appeared at her door again, this time carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of metal containers. "As promised," he said, setting the bag carefully inside her door. "Canned peaches, beans, and some lamp oil. There's more in the wagon if you need it." Eleanor examined the offering, impressed by the quality of the goods. These weren't the rough provisions typically available at frontier stores, but higher-grade supplies that suggested Colt took pride in what he carried. "This is generous," she said, stepping aside to let him fully enter. "More than generous for just a night's shelter." Colt removed his hat and shook the snow from his coat, revealing dark hair touched with grey at the temples and a face that, while weathered, held an unexpected kindness. "Winter's hard enough without neighbors turning each other away. Besides, I've got more than I can use myself." Eleanor poured coffee for both of them, noting how Colt took in the details of her home without seeming to pry. His gaze lingered briefly on Thomas's coat by the door and the single-place setting on the table, but he made no comment about her obviously solitary circumstances. "You said you run supplies between settlements," Eleanor said, settling into her chair across from him. "That's dangerous work, especially this time of year." "It can be," Colt agreed, warming his hands around the coffee cup. "But there are folks in these mountains who depend on what I bring. Medicine for the sick, winter clothes for the children, supplies to get families through the hard months. Someone needs to make sure they get what they need." There was something in his tone that suggested this work was more than just business for him, that he understood what it meant to be cut off from the world when survival depended on preparation and community support. "Where are you from originally?" Eleanor asked, curious about this man who'd appeared in her storm. Colt was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Here and there. I've spent time in Colorado, some in Wyoming. Montana's been my territory for the past few years." He looked up at her with those steady grey eyes. "What about you? You seem well suited to this country." "Born in Missouri, came west with my husband 12 years ago. We thought Montana would be a good place to build something lasting." Eleanor's voice caught slightly on the past tense, and she saw Colt notice, though he didn't press for details. "It's good country for that," he said simply. "Hard country, but honest. A person can make something real here if they're willing to work for it." The storm continued to rage outside, and Eleanor found herself oddly comfortable with this stranger's presence. There was something calming about Colt's manner, a quality of quiet confidence that made her feel less alone without making her feel threatened. "The storm looks like it might last through tomorrow," she observed, glancing toward the window where snow continued to pile against the glass. Could be, Colt agreed. I've seen November storms that lasted 3 days. If you don't mind the company, I'm content to wait it out. I've got bedroll and supplies in the wagon. Eleanor considered this. The proper thing would be to insist he stay in the barn with his horses, but the storm was brutal, and she found herself reluctant to send anyone back out into that frozen hell. There's a spare room, she heard herself saying. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. Colt looked surprised by the offer. That's very kind, Mum, but I don't want to impose. The barn will do fine. Nonsense. No one should have to sleep in a barn in weather like this. Eleanor stood, decision made. I'll get you some blankets. It was going to be a nursery, but we never... She stopped, the old pain rising unexpectedly. Colt's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry for your loss, Ma'am. Both losses, it seems. Eleanor nodded, grateful that he didn't require her to explain further. Eleanor Hayes, she said, realizing they'd been talking for an hour without proper introductions. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Hayes, and thank you for the kindness. I won't forget it. As Eleanor prepared the spare room, she found herself wondering what Thomas would think of her decision to shelter this stranger. But somehow, she thought he would approve. Thomas had always believed in helping those who needed it, and there was something about Colt McCallister that suggested he was a man who could be trusted. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Eleanor realized that tomorrow would bring new questions about this unexpected guest and what his presence might mean for the winter ahead. But for tonight, for the first time in months, her house didn't feel quite so empty, and that was enough. The storm lasted 2 days, and by the time it finally exhausted itself, Eleanor and Colt had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. She woke each morning to the sound of him moving quietly through the house, already dressed and preparing to tend to the animals. By the time she made it to the kitchen, there would be fresh coffee brewing, and the fire built up to chase away the night's chill. You don't have to do all this, Eleanor said on the second morning, finding him returning from the barn with a pail of fresh milk from her cow. I've been managing on my own. Colt set the pail on the kitchen counter and brushed snow from his coat. I know you have, but while I'm here, seems only right to help with the work. Besides, your animals seem to appreciate the company. Eleanor had noticed that too. Her horses, usually skittish around strangers, had taken to Colt immediately. She'd watched through the window as he worked with them, his movements calm and confident, speaking to them in low tones that seemed to settle their spirits. Even her chickens, normally territorial about their coop, appeared to welcome his presence. You have a way with animals, she observed, preparing eggs for breakfast. That's not a skill everyone possesses. Animals are honest, Colt replied, settling into what had become his chair at her table. They judge a person by their actions, not their words or their past. I find that refreshing. There was something in his tone that suggested deeper meaning, but Eleanor didn't press. Instead, she found herself studying his hands as he reached for his coffee cup, strong hands, marked by years of outdoor work, but gentle in their movements. They reminded her of Thomas's hands, though Colt's bore different scars, different stories. I was thinking, Eleanor said as she served the eggs. Once the weather clears enough for travel, you might want to consider staying in town until spring. The pass can be treacherous in winter, and there's no telling when the next storm might hit. Colt was quiet for a moment, cutting his eggs with deliberate care. That's good advice. Though I have to admit I've grown comfortable with the arrangement we have here. If you don't mind the company, that is. Eleanor felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months, a lightness that might have been the beginning of happiness. The truth was, she had grown comfortable with Colt's presence. 2. The house felt alive again, with another person moving through it, and the conversations they shared over meals had reminded her how much she missed simple, human companionship. I don't mind, she said, perhaps too quickly. I mean, it's practical. You have supplies I need, and I have shelter you need. It makes sense. Practical, Colt agreed, though there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood the arrangement had already moved beyond mere practicality. After breakfast, they worked together to clear the snow from the pathways and check on the outbuildings. Eleanor found herself watching Colt as he moved around her property, noting how he seemed to instinctively understand what needed doing. He reinforced a loose board on the chicken coop without being asked, tightened a gate hinge that had been bothering her for weeks, and even noticed that one of her fence posts was beginning to lean. "You don't have to fix everything," Eleanor said, though she was grateful for his attention to these details. "Old habits," Colt replied, testing the stability of the fence post. "I notice things that need mending. Can't seem to help myself." Eleanor retrieved Thomas's toolbox from the barn, the wooden case that had sat untouched since his death. She hesitated for a moment before offering it to Colt, knowing it represented another small step away from the shrine she'd made of her husband's memory. "These might help," she said, setting the box beside him. Colt opened it carefully, his fingers tracing the worn handles of tools that had been shaped by another man's grip. "These are good tools, well cared for. Your husband was a craftsman." "He was. He could fix anything, build anything we needed. I always felt safe knowing that if something broke, Thomas could make it right again." Colt selected a hammer and tested its weight. "It's a good feeling. Being able to fix things makes a man feel useful." He glanced at Eleanor. "Though I suspect you're more capable than you give yourself credit for. I've learned some things since." She paused, still finding it difficult to speak of Thomas's death directly. "I've had to learn, but there's still so much I don't know." "Knowledge comes with time and necessity," Colt said, beginning work on the fence post. "And you've got both." Eleanor found herself drawn into helping him, holding boards steady while he nailed them in place, handing him tools before he asked for them. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside someone again, sharing the burden of maintaining the property that had been hers and Thomas's dream. "Were you married?" Eleanor asked as they worked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." Colt paused in his hammering, considering his answer. "Once, long time ago, didn't work out the way either of us hoped." Eleanor heard the finality in his tone and didn't pursue the subject, but she found herself curious about what had shaped this quiet, capable man. There were depths to Colt McCallister that suggested a complicated past, but also a fundamental decency that made her feel safe in his presence. That evening, as they shared another meal together, Eleanor realized she was cooking with more care than she had in months. She'd prepared Thomas's favorite pot roast, using vegetables from her garden and herbs she'd dried herself. The act of cooking for another person awakened something in her that had been dormant since her husband's death. A pleasure in domestic life that went beyond mere survival. "This is remarkable," Colt said, savoring the meal. "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked dinner like this." Eleanor felt a flush of pride at the compliment. Cooking for one person never seems worth the effort. It's nice to have someone to cook for again. They talked about inconsequential things. The weather, the challenges of frontier life, books they'd read. But underneath the casual conversation, Eleanor sensed a growing connection that had little to do with practical necessity. There was something about Colt's presence that made her feel more like herself again, more like the woman she'd been before grief had hollowed her out. After dinner, Colt insisted on helping with the dishes, a gesture that touched Eleanor more than she expected. Thomas had never helped with kitchen work, considering it women's domain, but Colt seemed to view it simply as part of maintaining a household together. "You don't have to do that," Eleanor protested, though she made no move to stop him. "My mother always said a man who won't help clean up after a meal doesn't deserve to eat it," Colt replied, carefully drying the plates. "Besides, it's peaceful work, gives a person time to think." Eleanor found herself studying his profile as he worked, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his hair fell across his forehead. There was something appealing about his steady concentration, the way he approached even simple tasks with careful attention. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Colt was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the dish towel. "About how comfortable this feels. About how long it's been since I've had a place that felt like home." The honesty of his answer caught Eleanor off guard, and she felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that she wasn't the only one who had been lonely, the only one who had been merely surviving rather than living. "It does feel comfortable," she admitted. "More comfortable than I expected." Their eyes met across the small kitchen, and Eleanor felt a flutter of something that might have been attraction. The realization startled her, bringing with it a wave of guilt that made her look away quickly. "I should check on the animals one more time," Colt said, seeming to sense her discomfort. "Make sure they're settled for the night." After he left, Eleanor sat alone at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. The house felt different now, warmer, more alive. But along with that warmth came a confusion she wasn't ready to face. She was a widow, still mourning her husband. She had no business feeling anything for this stranger who had appeared in her storm. But as she listened to Colt moving quietly through the barn, speaking in gentle tones to the animals, Eleanor couldn't deny that something was changing inside her. Whether that change was healing or betrayal, she wasn't sure she was ready to discover. A week passed before Eleanor found herself standing at the door to Thomas's workshop, Colt beside her with a broken bridle in his hands. The room had remained untouched since her husband's death, his wood-carving tools still arranged exactly as he'd left them, wood shavings still scattered across the workbench like evidence of interrupted dreams. "You don't have to," Eleanor said, though she'd been the one to suggest that Colt might find what he needed to repair the bridle among Thomas's leather working supplies. "Only if you're comfortable with it," Colt replied gently. "I know this room means a great deal to you." Eleanor pushed open the door, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and leather oil that had always meant home to her. Thomas had spent countless evenings in this workshop, crafting furniture for their house, carving toys for children they'd hoped to have, working with his hands in a way that brought him peace after long days in the fields. "He made beautiful things," Colt observed, running his fingers along the smooth surface of an unfinished rocking chair. "This is fine craftsmanship." Eleanor traced the chair's curved arm, remembering the excitement in Thomas's voice when he'd started the project. He was making it for the baby we thought we might have. He never got to finish it. The pain of that old loss still had the power to catch her off guard, but somehow it felt less sharp with Colt present. His quiet understanding seemed to absorb some of the grief's intensity without diminishing its importance. "Would it help if I finished it?" Colt asked carefully. "I have some experience with woodworking. I could complete it the way he intended." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. The offer was both generous and presumptuous, touching something deep in her heart while also challenging her carefully preserved sense of Thomas's memory. "Why would you do that?" Colt set down the broken bridle and faced her fully. "Because some things are meant to be completed. Because your husband put love into this chair, and that love deserves to see fulfillment, even if he can't be here to provide it himself." The thoughtfulness of his answer moved Eleanor more than she expected. She found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. "All right, but only if you let me help. Thomas tried to teach me some basic techniques, though I never had much patience for it." "I'd like that," Colt said simply. Over the following days, they established a new routine. Mornings were spent on the practical work of maintaining the homestead, but afternoons found them in Thomas's workshop, working together on the rocking chair and other unfinished projects. Eleanor discovered that Colt's hands were as skilled with wood as they were gentle with animals, his movements sure and precise as he shaped the remaining pieces needed to complete the chair. "You have real talent for this," Eleanor observed, watching him sand the chair's runners to perfect smoothness. "Where did you learn?" "Here and there," Colt replied, his standard response to questions about his past. "I've found that working with your hands is good for settling the mind, gives a man something constructive to focus on. Eleanor sensed there was more to the story, but she'd learned not to press him for details he wasn't ready to share. Instead, she found herself studying the concentration on his face as he worked, the way his brow furrowed slightly when he encountered a challenging joint, the satisfaction that flickered in his eyes when a piece fit exactly as it should. "Thomas would have liked you," she found herself saying one afternoon as they worked side by side, she holding boards steady while he secured them with careful precision. Colt paused in his work, looking at her with surprise. "What makes you say that? You approach things the same way he did, thoughtfully. You don't rush and you don't cut corners. He always said you could tell a man's character by how he treated the small tasks, the ones nobody else would notice. Sounds like he was a wise man." He was. He saw the best in people, sometimes even when they couldn't see it themselves. Eleanor realized as she spoke that she was talking about Thomas more easily than she had in months, the memories flowing without the sharp edge of pain that had accompanied them before. "That's a rare gift," Colt said quietly. "The world needs more people like that." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Eleanor looked through the workshop window to see Margaret Hendricks and two other women from town riding up to the house, their faces set with the kind of determination that usually meant trouble. "Company," Eleanor murmured, suddenly conscious of how the arrangement with Colt might appear to outside observers. Colt set down his tools and straightened, his expression becoming more guarded. "Perhaps I should make myself scarce." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "This is as much your place as mine now. If they have something to say, they can say it to both of us." They walked to the house together, Eleanor noting how Colt positioned himself slightly behind her, close enough to offer support, but not so close as to appear presumptuous. The gesture spoke to a sensitivity about her position that she found both touching and reassuring. Margaret dismounted first, her face wearing the careful expression of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. The other women, Sarah Jameson and Beth Mueller, remained mounted, their disapproval evident in their rigid postures. "Eleanor, dear," Margaret began, her tone overly bright, "we thought we'd stop by to see how you're managing. The whole town's been worried about you out here alone." Eleanor felt Colt's presence behind her like a steadying force. "As you can see, I'm managing quite well, thank you." Margaret's gaze flickered to Colt, taking in his work clothes and the comfortable way he stood beside Eleanor. "Yes, we'd heard you had a guest, Mr. McCallister, isn't it?" "Ma'am," Colt replied with a polite nod, his tone neutral but respectful. Sarah Jameson leaned forward in her saddle, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Eleanor, surely you understand how this looks. A widow woman living alone with a man she barely knows. People are talking." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it was anger rather than shame. "People can talk all they like. Mr. McCallister has been nothing but helpful and respectful. I won't apologize for accepting assistance when it's offered in good faith." "It's not about apologies," Beth Mueller interjected. "It's about propriety, about what's decent and what's not. Your husband's been gone barely 4 months, Eleanor." The mention of Thomas sent a spike of pain through Eleanor's chest, but it was followed immediately by a surge of protective anger. These women had no right to dictate how she honored her husband's memory or how she chose to survive in his absence. "My husband would want me to be safe and cared for," Eleanor replied firmly. "He would want me to accept help when it's offered and to extend hospitality to those who need it. That's the kind of man he was, and those are the values he taught me." Colt stepped slightly forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Ladies, I understand your concern for Mrs. Hayes's reputation. I want you to know that I have nothing but the deepest respect for her and for the memory of her husband. My presence here is purely a matter of mutual assistance during a difficult season." Margaret's expression softened slightly at Colt's respectful tone, but Sarah and Beth remained unmoved. "Words are easy, Mr. McCallister. Sarah said coldly. It's actions that matter, and the action of living here unmarried with a woman in mourning speaks louder than any pretty speeches. Eleanor felt something crystallize inside her chest, a clarity that cut through months of grief and uncertainty. These women meant well, perhaps, but they were asking her to choose their comfort over her own survival, their sense of propriety over her own happiness. I appreciate your concern, Eleanor said, her voice steady and final, but my decisions are my own to make. Mr. McCallister is welcome here as long as he chooses to stay, and I won't be swayed by gossip or social pressure. The three women exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that Eleanor wouldn't be easily moved. Margaret sighed, her disappointment evident. I hope you know what you're doing, Eleanor. I truly do. After they left, Eleanor and Colt stood together in the yard, watching the horses disappear down the valley road. Eleanor felt shaken by the confrontation, but also oddly liberated. She'd made a choice, and in making it, she'd discovered something about her own strength that she hadn't known was there. I'm sorry you had to endure that, Colt said quietly. If my presence here is causing you problems, your presence here is the best thing that's happened to me in months, Eleanor interrupted, surprising them both with her vehemence. Don't you dare apologize for being kind to me. Colt looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made her heart race. Eleanor, he said softly, and the way he spoke her name sent warmth spreading through her chest. For a moment, they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, could smell the scent of wood shavings and honest work that clung to his clothes. She felt drawn to him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying, a pull that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere loneliness. Then Colt stepped back, his expression becoming carefully neutral again. We should finish that chair before the light fades. Eleanor nodded, understanding that he was offering her time to process what had just passed between them. But as they returned to the workshop, she found herself stealing glances at his hands as he worked, remembering the gentle way he'd spoken her name and wondering what it might feel like to be touched by someone again. Not as Thomas's widow, but as Eleanor, a woman in her own right. November deepened into December, and with it came the kind of cold that settled into your bones and stayed there. The snow piled higher against Eleanor's windows each day, creating a world that felt both beautiful and isolated. She and Colt had fallen into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Morning chores shared in comfortable silence, afternoons working together in the workshop, evenings by the fire with books or quiet conversation. It was during one of these peaceful mornings that everything changed. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard Colt's sharp intake of breath from the front room. She found him standing by the window, holding an envelope in his hands, his face pale beneath his winter tan. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the letter. Colt looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, fear mixed with something that might have been resignation. "Just correspondence from my past. Nothing that concerns you." But Eleanor had grown to read the subtle changes in Colt's demeanor over the weeks they'd shared, and this was more than casual correspondence. The careful way he folded the letter, the tension that had suddenly appeared in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided hers, all of it spoke to something significant and troubling. "Colt," she said gently, "if something's wrong, I'd like to help if I can." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered landscape as if seeing something she couldn't. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "There are things about my past, Eleanor. Things I'm not proud of, things that might be better left buried." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Over the weeks they'd spent together, she'd sensed there were depths to Colt that he kept carefully hidden, but she'd assumed they were the normal scars that came from a hard life on the frontier. This felt different, heavier somehow, more dangerous. "We all have things we're not proud of," she said carefully, "but you're not the same man you were in the past. I can see that much." Colt turned to look at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes that made her heart ache. "How can you be so certain? You don't really know me, Eleanor. You know the man I've been here in this place with you, but that might not be who I really am." The doubt in his voice stirred something protective in Eleanor's chest. Over the weeks they'd spent together, she'd seen Colt's character revealed in countless small actions. The gentle way he cared for her animals, his respectful treatment of her grief, his careful attention to her comfort and safety. Those weren't the actions of a man pretending to be good. They were the actions of a man who simply was good, regardless of what he might have done in his past. "I know you," she said firmly. "I know you're kind and patient and honest. I know you work hard and never ask for more than you give. I know you've made me feel less alone without making me feel pressured or threatened. That's who you are, Colt. Whatever happened before doesn't change that." Something shifted in Colt's expression at her words. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. But it was quickly replaced by that careful guardedness that told Eleanor he was retreating from her again. "You have more faith in people than they deserve," he said quietly. "Maybe, or maybe I've learned to recognize genuine goodness when I see it." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders this time, their voices carrying across the snow as they drew near the house. Eleanor and Colt exchanged glances, both recognizing that visitors in weather like this usually meant either emergency or trouble. Eleanor opened the door to find 5 men on horseback, their faces grim beneath frost-covered beards. She recognized 2 of them, Robert Mueller, Beth's husband, and James Patterson, who owned the largest ranch in the area. The others were strangers, but their bearing suggested they were men accustomed to having their authority respected. "Mrs. Hayes," Robert Mueller said, touching his hat brim but not dismounting, "we need to speak with your guest." Eleanor felt Colt move to stand behind her, his presence both comforting and concerning. "What business do you have with Mr. McCallister?" James Patterson leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes fixed on Colt with unmistakable hostility. "That depends on whether Mr. McCallister is willing to answer some questions about his background and his intentions in our community." Eleanor felt her temper flare at the implied threat in Patterson's tone. "Mr. McCallister is my guest, and as such he's under my protection. If you have questions, you can ask them civilly or not at all." One of the strangers, a hard-faced man with a marshal's badge visible beneath his coat, spoke up. "Ma'am, we appreciate your position, but this is official business. We've received reports about a man matching Mr. McCallister's description, and we need to verify his identity." Eleanor felt Colt's hand touch her shoulder lightly, a gesture of gratitude for her defense, but also perhaps a signal for her to step aside. When she looked back at him, she saw that his expression had become carefully neutral, though tension radiated from every line of his body. "What kind of reports?" Colt asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The marshal's eyes narrowed as he studied Colt's face. "Reports about a man involved in some troubling incidents down Colorado Way. Man who might be traveling under an assumed name, carrying supplies as a cover for other activities." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The careful way the marshal spoke, the hostile expressions of the other men, the fear she'd seen in Colt's eyes when he read that letter. Suddenly pieces were falling into place in a pattern she didn't want to recognize. "I think there's been some mistake," Eleanor said firmly, though doubt was beginning to creep into her voice. "Mr. McCallister is a supplier, nothing more. He's been helpful and respectful during his stay here." "I'm sure he has been, ma'am," the marshal replied, though his tone suggested he found her naivety touching rather than convincing. "Men who live by deception are often quite charming when it suits their purposes." Eleanor felt Colt tense beside her at the word deception, and when she glanced at his face, she saw something there that made her stomach tighten with unease. Not guilt exactly, but recognition, as if the marshal's words had struck closer to truth than Colt was comfortable with. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside," Colt said quietly. Mrs. Hayes shouldn't have to stand in the cold while we sort this out. The marshal dismounted, followed by the other men, and Eleanor found herself leading a group of hostile strangers into her warm kitchen. The contrast between the comfortable domesticity of the space and the tension that now filled it felt jarring, as if two different worlds had suddenly collided. "Now then," the marshal said, settling into what had become Colt's usual chair, "suppose you tell us your real name and what you're really doing in this territory." Colt remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that struck Eleanor as oddly formal. "My name is Colt McCallister, and I'm exactly what I claim to be, a man who carries supplies to settlements that can't easily reach larger towns." "And before that?" James Patterson demanded. "What were you doing before you became such a helpful citizen?" Eleanor watched Colt's face carefully, looking for signs of the man she'd come to know beneath whatever mask he might be wearing now. What she saw there was complex. Caution, yes, but also a kind of weary honesty that suggested he was tired of carrying whatever burden his past represented. "Before that, I made some poor choices," Colt said quietly. "Choices I've spent the last several years trying to make amends for." The marshal leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "What kind of poor choices, Mr. McCallister?" Eleanor held her breath, suddenly afraid of what she might learn about the man who had become so important to her peace of mind. The silence stretched between them like a held note, full of possibilities she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. "The kind that hurt people who didn't deserve it," Colt replied finally. "The kind that a man spends the rest of his life trying to atone for." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. The careful way Colt spoke, the pain in his voice, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, all of it pointed to secrets far more serious than she'd imagined. She thought of all the evenings they'd spent together, all the conversations where she'd felt so safe, so understood. Had it all been built on deception? "Mrs. Hayes," the marshal said, turning his attention to her, "has Mr. McCallister given you any reason to question his story? Any behavior that seemed inconsistent with his claimed profession?" Eleanor looked at Colt, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since that snowy night when he'd appeared at her door. The careful way he'd always deflected questions about his past, his obvious skill with tools and animals that suggested a more complex background than simple merchant work. The way he sometimes seemed to be listening for sounds beyond her hearing, all of it took on new significance in light of the marshal's questions. But she also saw the man who had helped her through her darkest winter, who had treated her with unfailing respect and kindness, who had brought warmth back into her empty house. Whatever Colt had done in his past, the man she knew was good. She was certain of that, even if she was no longer certain of anything else. "No," she said finally, "he's been nothing but helpful and honest in his dealings with me." The marshal nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "Well then, Mr. McCallister, perhaps you'd be willing to accompany us to town to clear up these questions about your identity. Shouldn't take long if you're truly who you claim to be." Eleanor felt panic rise in her throat. Whatever was happening here, whatever Colt had or hadn't done, the thought of losing him now felt unbearable. He had become her anchor in a world that had felt adrift since Thomas's death, and the possibility that he might be taken from her sent fear racing through her veins. "That won't be necessary," Eleanor heard herself saying. "Mr. McCallister is my guest, and I vouch for his character completely." The marshal's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Ma'am, I appreciate your loyalty, but if this man has been deceiving you—" "He hasn't," Eleanor said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty. "I don't care what he might have done before he came here. I know who he is now, and that's enough for me." She felt Colt's eyes on her, but she didn't dare look at him. Instead, she held the marshal's gaze steadily, pouring all her conviction into her voice. "I see," the marshal said slowly. "Well, Mrs. Hayes, I hope for your sake that your faith isn't misplaced, but understand that if we find evidence that Mr. McCallister has been involved in anything illegal, your protection won't extend very far." After the men left, Eleanor and Colt stood alone in her kitchen, the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them like smoke. Eleanor felt as if she were seeing him for the first time, this man whose presence had become so essential to her. Daily happiness. The doubt the marshal had planted was growing, but so was her determination to trust in what she had seen with her own eyes. "Eleanor," Colt said quietly, "I need you to know—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, turning to face him fully. "Whatever you're about to tell me, whatever you think I need to know about your past, I don't want to hear it. Not now. Not like this." Colt looked at her with an expression of surprise and something that might have been relief. "Are you certain?" Eleanor thought about Thomas's words, about the difference between surviving and living. Loving someone, and she was beginning to admit that's what her feelings for Colt had become, meant accepting them fully, past and all. It meant choosing trust over fear, hope over safety. "I'm certain," she said. "The man you were before doesn't matter to me. The man you are now does." But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that Colt's mysterious past was far from finished with them, and that the reckoning they'd just postponed was merely the calm before a much larger storm. The days following the marshal's visit carried a different quality, as if the very air in Eleanor's house had changed. She and Colt maintained their routines, but now every conversation felt weighted with unspoken questions, every glance loaded with meanings neither was ready to explore. Eleanor caught herself studying Colt when he wasn't looking, searching for signs of the mysterious past that seemed to follow him like a shadow. It was while helping him organize medical supplies from his wagon that Eleanor first glimpsed the depth of knowledge he'd been concealing. She'd cut her hand on a broken jar, a deep gash that sent blood flowing freely down her palm. Before she could even call out, Colt was there, his hands steady and sure as he cleaned and examined the wound. "Hold still," he said, his voice carrying an authority she'd never heard before. "It's deeper than it looks, but it missed the important structures. You'll need stitches." Eleanor watched in amazement as Colt worked, his movements precise and confident. He selected needle and thread from his supplies with practiced efficiency, then began stitching her wound with the skill of someone who had done this many times before. "Where did you learn to do this?" Eleanor asked, mesmerized by the sure movement of his hands. Colt paused for just a moment, his needle halfway through another stitch. "A man learns many things when he's far from doctors and people depend on him to help." It was another of his carefully vague answers, but Eleanor sensed there was more truth in it than usual. She watched his face as he worked, noting the concentration. There, the way his brow furrowed with professional concern. This wasn't the fumbling first aid of a frontier merchant. This was the work of someone with real medical training. "You're very good at this," she observed. "Almost like you've had formal instruction." Colt's hands stilled for a moment, and when he looked up at her, Eleanor saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "I did once. A long time ago, in what feels like another life." "What happened to that life?" Colt resumed his stitching, his focus intense on the delicate work. "I made choices that closed those doors to me, choices that meant I could never go back to being the man I was trained to be." Eleanor felt her heart ache at the pain in his voice. Whatever he had done, whatever choices he was referring to, it was clear they still caused him deep regret. She found herself wanting to comfort him, to tell him that everyone deserved a second chance at redemption. "Maybe those doors don't have to stay closed forever," she said gently. Colt finished the last stitch and tied off the thread, then began wrapping her hand with practiced efficiency. "Some doors, once closed, can't be opened again. Some choices can't be undone, no matter how much a man might wish otherwise." That afternoon, word came that young Timothy Walsh, the 8-year-old son of a family living in the high country, had taken badly ill with a fever that wouldn't break. The boy's father had ridden hard to town seeking help, but the nearest doctor was snowed in 50 miles away, and the child was getting worse by the hour. Eleanor found Colt in the barn, checking on the horses with unusual restlessness. When she told him about Timothy, she saw something change in his expression, a sharpening of focus that transformed his entire demeanor. "How far to the Walsh place?" he asked, already moving toward his medical supplies. "About 10 miles through rough country. Colt, surely you're not thinking—" "That boy needs help," Colt interrupted, gathering bottles and instruments with swift precision. "If there's no doctor available, then someone has to try." Eleanor watched him work, recognizing that she was seeing yet another facet of this complex man. The careful merchant facade had fallen away completely, replaced by someone who moved with the urgency and authority of a trained physician. "You could go to town," she said. "Tell them what's happening. Let someone else." "There isn't time," Colt replied, securing his medical bag. "Fever in a child can turn dangerous quickly. Every hour we delay could make the difference between life and death." Within an hour, they were riding through the snow toward the Walsh homestead, Colt's medical supplies packed carefully in saddlebags designed for such emergencies. Eleanor noted how naturally he'd assumed she would come with him, and how right that assumption felt. They had become a team, she realized, partners in whatever challenges arose. The Walsh cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin grey line against the winter sky. They could hear the child's labored breathing before they even dismounted, a harsh sound that spoke of lungs fighting against something they couldn't defeat alone. Inside, they found Thomas Walsh, a bear of a man reduced to helpless anxiety, hovering over his son's bedside, while his wife Mary bathed the boy's fevered forehead with cool cloths. Timothy was unconscious, his small face flushed and hot, his breathing rapid and shallow. Colt moved immediately to the child's side, his hands gentle but thorough as he examined the boy. Eleanor watched him work, noting how his entire manner had changed. Gone was any trace of uncertainty or secretiveness. This was a man completely in his element, drawing on knowledge and experience that ran deeper than any secrets he might be keeping. "How long has he been like this?" Colt asked, pressing his ear to Timothy's chest to listen to his breathing. 3 days, Mary Walsh replied, her voice tight with worry. "Started with a cough. Then the fever came on fast. We've tried everything. We know, but nothing seems to help." Colt continued his examination, checking the boy's throat, feeling for swollen glands, testing his reflexes. Eleanor could see him processing information, making decisions based on knowledge she could only guess at. "It's pneumonia," Colt said finally, his voice calm but serious. "His lungs are filling with fluid. Without treatment, he could die within days." Mary Walsh let out a soft cry of distress, and her husband moved protectively to her side. "What can we do?" Thomas asked. "Tell us what to do." Colt was already reaching for his medical supplies, pulling out bottles of medicine Eleanor didn't recognize. "I can help him, but it's going to require some treatments that might seem unusual. You'll need to trust me completely." Eleanor watched as Colt began administering medicines, explaining each step to the anxious parents with the patience and authority of someone accustomed to dealing with medical crises. His hands were steady as he prepared compounds, measured dosages, and administered treatments that seemed to come from deep professional knowledge. "Where did you learn all this?" Thomas Walsh asked, echoing Eleanor's own unspoken question. Colt paused in his work, glancing briefly at Eleanor before answering. "I trained as a doctor many years ago. I don't practice anymore, but the knowledge remains." "Why don't you practice?" Mary asked. The question hung in the air like smoke, and Eleanor saw Colt's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I lost that right," he said quietly, "but I can still help when someone needs it." Over the next several hours, Eleanor watched Colt work with a skill and dedication that took her breath away. He monitored Timothy's breathing, adjusted medications, showed the parents how to position the boy to help him breathe more easily. Gradually, almost miraculously, the child's condition began to improve. His breathing became less labored, his fever started to break, and by evening he was conscious and asking for water. "You saved his life," Mary Walsh said to Colt, tears streaming. down her face. "How can we ever repay you?" Colt packed his supplies with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown all day. "No payment necessary. Just take care of that boy and remember to keep his lungs clear of fluid for the next few days." As they rode home through the gathering darkness, Eleanor found herself seeing Colt in an entirely new light. The man beside her wasn't just a mysterious supplier with a questionable past. He was someone who had dedicated his life to healing others, someone whose knowledge and skill could mean the difference between life and death for people like young Timothy Walsh. "You were a doctor," she said, not really a question. "I was," Colt replied simply, "and you gave that up because of whatever happened in your past." Colt was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the crunch of their horses' hooves in the snow. "I lost the right to practice when I made choices that violated everything I'd sworn to uphold. The medical profession has standards, Eleanor. When you break those standards, you lose the privilege of calling yourself a doctor." Eleanor felt her heart ache for him, understanding now the depth of loss he carried. To have such a gift, such ability to help others, and to lose the right to use it because of past mistakes, it was a burden she could barely imagine. "But you still help people. Like Timothy, when I can, quietly, without drawing attention to myself. It's the only way. I can make amends for what I've done." They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, but Eleanor's mind was spinning with new understanding. Whatever Colt had done in his past, whatever choices had cost him his medical career, the man she knew now was someone who risked exposure to save a child's life. That spoke to a character that went far deeper than any mistakes he might have made. That night, as they sat by the fire sharing a quiet dinner, Eleanor found herself studying Colt's hands as he ate, the same hands that had stitched her wound and saved Timothy Walsh's life. They were good hands, gentle hands, hands that healed rather than harmed. "Colt," she said softly, "whatever you did before, whoever you were, it doesn't change who you are now. I want you to know that." Colt looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw a mixture of gratitude and pain that made her want to reach across the table and take his hands in hers. "You have more faith in me than I deserve," he said quietly. "Maybe," Eleanor replied, "or maybe I can see who you really are underneath all the guilt and regret. Maybe I can see the man you've become rather than the man you think you used to be." Something shifted in Colt's expression then, a softening that spoke of hope cautiously emerging from behind walls of self-protection. Eleanor felt her own heart racing, recognizing that they were approaching territory that would change everything between them. "Eleanor," Colt said, his voice rough with emotion, "yes, I'm falling in love with you." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, beautiful and terrifying in their honesty. Eleanor felt her breath catch, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked into Colt's eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. "I know," she whispered. "I'm falling in love with you too." The admission seemed to break something open between them. All the careful distance they'd been maintaining, suddenly feeling unnecessary and artificial. Eleanor rose from her chair at the same moment Colt did, and then they were standing close enough to touch, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his grey eyes and the way his breath caught when she lifted her hand to touch his. "Evase, this complicates things," Colt said softly, though he made no move to step away from her. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Eleanor replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. When Colt kissed her, it was with the careful reverence of a man who understood the preciousness of what he was being offered. Eleanor felt herself melt into him, into the warmth and strength and surprising gentleness of his embrace. It was nothing like the passionate urgency of youth. This was something deeper, richer, born of understanding and choice rather than simple desire. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor rested her forehead against Colt's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and feeling more alive than she had since Thomas's death. "What happens now?" she asked. Colt's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a soft kiss to the top of her head. "I don't know," he admitted, But whatever it is, we'll face it together." Eleanor nodded, knowing that they had crossed a line tonight that would change everything. Whatever secrets Colt still carried, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer afraid to face them. Love, she was learning, was not about knowing everything about someone. It was about choosing to trust them with your heart despite the unknowns. But even as she held on to that thought, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was temporary, that the shadows from Colt's past were still circling, waiting for the right moment to emerge and test the strength of what they were building together. The wanted poster arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a young deputy whose horse was lathered with sweat despite the frigid air. Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the commotion in the front yard. Raised voices, the stamping of horses, and underneath it all, a quality of tension that made her stomach clench with foreboding. She found Colt standing in their kitchen, the deputy and Marshal Harrison facing him across the table where she and Colt had shared so many peaceful meals. Between them lay a piece of paper that seemed to draw all the light from the room, and when Eleanor caught sight of the image printed there, her world tilted on its axis. The face staring back at her from the wanted poster was unmistakably Colt's. Though younger, harder somehow. The name beneath the sketch read Dr. Colton McKinnon, and below that in stark black letters, wanted for robbery, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. This couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. The gentleman who had stitched her wound, who had saved Timothy Walsh's life, who had held her with such reverence just days before, he couldn't be the same person described in those terrible words. "Mrs. Hayes," Marshal Harrison said, his voice not unkind but implacable. "I need you to step back while we discuss this matter with Mr. McKinnon." "His name is McCallister," Eleanor said automatically, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "No, ma'am," the marshal replied gently. "His name is Colton McKinnon, and he's wanted in connection with a series of crimes committed in Colorado Territory 3 years ago." Eleanor looked at Colton, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for any sign that this was the horrible mistake she desperately wanted it to be. What she saw instead was a resignation so complete it felt like watching someone die. "It's true," Colt said quietly, his eyes meeting hers across the kitchen that had become their sanctuary. "My real name is Colton McKinnon, and I am wanted for those crimes." The simple admission hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, feeling as though the foundation of everything she'd built her new life upon had just crumbled beneath her feet. "But you didn't do them," she said, the words more plea than statement. "You couldn't have done those things." Colt's expression was infinitely gentle, infinitely sad. "I did do them, Eleanor. Every one of them." The marshal stepped forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Dr. McKinnon, you'll need to come with us. We have a jail cell in town where you can wait while we sort out the details of your extradition to Colorado." "Wait," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now despite the chaos in her chest. "What exactly is he accused of? What evidence do you have?" Marshal Harrison picked up the wanted poster, reading from it in an official tone that made the words seem even more damning. "Dr. Colton McKinnon is wanted in connection with the robbery of a Union Pacific payroll train, during which 3 guards were killed. He's also accused of treating wounded members of the McKenna gang and providing them with information about law enforcement activities in the region." Eleanor felt sick. Train robbery, murder, conspiracy with known criminals. These weren't the minor transgressions she'd imagined when Colt spoke of his past mistakes. These were serious felonies that could see him hanged. "There has to be more to the story," she said desperately. "Colt isn't a killer. He's a healer. I've seen him work." "Eleanor," Colt interrupted gently, "please don't make this harder than it has to be." She whirled to face him, anger flaring alongside her fear and confusion. "Don't make this harder? You lied to me, Colt. You let me fall in love with you while you were hiding the fact that you're a wanted criminal. Pain flickered across Colt's face at her words, but he didn't defend himself. You're right. I should have told you from the beginning. I should have been honest about who I was and what I'd done. Why weren't you? Eleanor demanded. Why did you let me believe you were just a merchant with a few regrets? Colt was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back in that formal posture she now recognized as a defense mechanism. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because for the first time in 3 years, I felt like a good man again. Being here with you, helping with your property, saving that boy, it reminded me of who I used to be before everything went wrong. I didn't want to lose that feeling. Eleanor felt tears threatening, but she pushed them back. So you decided to lie instead. You decided to let me build my feelings on a foundation of deception. I told myself I would leave before it went too far, Colt said miserably. I told myself I could protect you from the truth by keeping my distance. But then I fell in love with you, and I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Marshal Harrison cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the personal drama unfolding in front of him. Dr. McKinnon, we really do need to go. The sooner we get this sorted out. I understand, Colt said, moving toward the door. Then he stopped and looked back at Eleanor, his grey eyes holding a pain so deep it made her chest ache. Eleanor, I need you to know, everything I felt for you was real. Everything I told you about who I am now, about wanting to make amends, that was all true. The only lie was my name. Eleanor watched as the marshal placed Colt in shackles, the iron bands around his wrists looking obscene against the hands that had been so gentle with her. Part of her wanted to throw herself between him and the lawman to declare that she didn't care what he'd done, that love was more important than past mistakes. But another part of her, the part that felt betrayed and foolish, remained silent. As they led him away, after they were gone, Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the wanted poster they'd left behind. The face looking back at her was the same one she'd grown to love, but now it seemed like a stranger's. How could she have been so wrong about someone? How could the man who had brought such peace to her life be the same person accused of such violence? She picked up the poster and read it more carefully, looking for details that might explain what had happened. The crimes had taken place in Colorado Territory 3 years ago. Dr. Colton McKinnon had been part of a group led by someone called Blackjack McKenna, a notorious outlaw who specialized in train robberies and bank holdups. According to the poster, McKinnon had served as the gang's doctor, treating their wounds and helping them evade capture. But more damning was the accusation that he had provided inside information about law enforcement movements, using his position as a respected physician to gather intelligence for the gang. Eleanor set the poster aside and walked to the window, looking out at the barn where Colt had cared for her animals with such gentleness. It didn't make sense. The man she knew could never have been involved in murder, could never have betrayed his oath as a physician to help criminals evade justice. But then she remembered the careful way he'd always deflected questions about his past, the haunted look that sometimes crossed his face when he thought she wasn't watching, the letter that had arrived and disturbed him so deeply. All of it took on new meaning now, painting a picture of a man carrying tremendous guilt about something far more serious than she'd imagined. The sound of approaching horses broke through her reverie. Margaret Hendricks and several other women from town were riding up to the house, their faces wearing expressions of vindicated concern mixed with genuine worry. "Eleanor, dear," Margaret said as she dismounted, "we heard what happened. Are you all right?" Eleanor opened the door, feeling suddenly very tired. "I'm fine, Margaret, shaken but fine." The women clustered around her, offering comfort and support, while also clearly hungry for details about what had transpired. Eleanor found herself answering their questions mechanically, part of her mind still struggling to reconcile the man she'd fallen in love with and the criminal described on the wanted poster. "We tried to warn you," Sarah Jameson said, though not unkindly. "We could tell there was something not right about him." "Could you?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. What gave him away? Nothing specific, Margaret admitted. Just a feeling. The way he always seemed to be listening for something, the way he never quite answered direct questions about his past. Men with honest backgrounds don't usually have so much to hide. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the truth in her friend's observations. She had noticed those things too, but had chosen to interpret them as the natural caution of a man who had lived a hard life. Now she wondered if her willingness to give Colt the benefit of the doubt had been wisdom or foolishness. "What will you do now?" Beth Mueller asked. "Will you stay here through the winter, or would you like to come stay with one of us until spring?" The practical question forced Eleanor to consider her immediate situation. With Colt gone, she was once again alone on her homestead, facing the remainder of a harsh Montana winter without the partner who had made it seem manageable. The supplies he'd brought would last a while, but eventually she would need to make decisions about her future that went far beyond simple survival. "I'll stay," Eleanor said firmly. "This is my home, and I won't be driven from it by scandal or gossip." Margaret squeezed her hand supportively. "Of course, dear. And you know we'll help however we can." After the women left, Eleanor found herself walking through the house, seeing evidence of Colt's presence everywhere. His coat still hung by the door, his coffee cup sat unwashed in the sink, and in the spare room that had become his few personal belongings lay scattered on the dresser like evidence of a life interrupted. She picked up a small wooden carving from his bedside table, a horse he'd been whittling during quiet evenings by the fire. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail perfectly rendered, and Eleanor found herself wondering how hands capable of such delicate artistry could have been involved in violence and theft. That evening, as she sat alone by the fire, Eleanor made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow, she would ride to town and speak with Colt herself. She needed to hear his side of the story, needed to understand how the man she'd fallen in love with could be the same person described in those damning accusations. Love might have made her foolish, but it hadn't made her weak. She would face the truth, whatever it turned out to be, and then she would decide what to do with her heart and her future. The wanted poster lay on the table beside her chair, Colt's face staring back at her in the lamplight. Tomorrow, she would learn whether the man in that picture was someone she could still love, or a stranger wearing the face of the man she'd lost her heart to. But tonight, she would mourn for the simple happiness she'd thought she'd found, and prepare herself for whatever revelations the morning might bring. Eleanor woke before dawn, her dreams haunted by fragments of memory that no longer seemed trustworthy. Every gentle touch, every quiet conversation, every moment of growing intimacy now carried the weight of deception. She dressed slowly, her hands trembling as she fastened the buttons of her heaviest coat. Today, she would ride to town and demand answers, regardless of how much those answers might hurt. The morning air was sharp enough to cut, and her breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the wind. As she saddled her horse, Eleanor found herself thinking about Thomas and the promise she'd made to him, to live, not just survive. Was seeking the truth about Colt living, or was she simply prolonging her own suffering by refusing to accept what seemed obvious? The ride to town took 2 hours through snow that had drifted knee-deep in places. Eleanor used the time to prepare herself for what she might hear, running through questions in her mind and trying to steel her heart against whatever revelations awaited her. By the time she reached the jail, she felt as ready as anyone could be to confront the ruins of their trust. She found Colt in a small cell at the back of the marshal's office, sitting on a narrow cot with his head in his hands. When he looked up at her approach, Eleanor saw that his face was haggard, as if he'd aged years in the single night since his arrest. "Eleanor," he said, rising to his feet, "I didn't expect you to come." "I need to understand," Eleanor replied, settling into the chair Marshal Harrison had provided. "I need to hear the truth from you, not from wanted posters and rumors." Colt nodded, moving to sit on the edge of his cot so they could face each other through the bars. The distance between them felt vast, despite being only a few feet, and Eleanor realized that the iron bars were the least significant barrier separating them now. "Where do you want me to start?" Colt asked quietly. "Start with your real name. Start with who you were before you became the man I thought I knew." Colt was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-suppressed memories. "My name is Colton McKinnon. I was born in Ohio, trained as a physician at Harvard Medical College. After graduation, I came west to practice medicine in mining towns and frontier settlements, places where doctors were desperately needed." Eleanor listened, trying to reconcile this educated, accomplished man with the rough merchant who had appeared at her door. "I was idealistic," Colt continued. "I believed that medical care should be available to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay or their position in society. I treated miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and yes, sometimes men who lived outside the law. The McKenna gang?" Colt's expression darkened. "Jack McKenna came to me 3 years ago with a bullet wound that would have killed him without immediate treatment. I knew he was an outlaw, knew that helping him might make me complicit in whatever crimes he'd committed. But I'd taken an oath to do no harm, to preserve life whenever possible." Eleanor felt a glimmer of understanding. "So you treated him." "I treated him. And when his men brought me other wounded members of their gang, I treated them too. I told myself I was just being a doctor, just following my oath, but it became more complicated than that." Colt stood and walked to the small window of his cell, looking out at the snowy street beyond. Jack McKenna was charismatic, persuasive. He convinced me that the banks and railroad companies he robbed were stealing from ordinary people, that he was evening the scales of justice. When he asked me to provide information about law enforcement movements in the area, I told myself I was protecting lives by helping the gang avoid violent confrontations. Eleanor felt her heart sink. This was the betrayal described on the wanted poster, a physician using his respected position to aid criminals. "But that's not the worst of it," Colt continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The worst came during their last job, the Union Pacific payroll robbery. I knew they were planning it, knew the date and time. I could have warned the authorities, could have prevented it entirely." "Why didn't you?" Colt turned back to face her, and Eleanor saw tears in his eyes. "Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of what would happen to me if my involvement with the gang became known. Because I chose my own safety over the lives of 3 innocent men." The raw honesty in his voice cut Eleanor to the bone. This wasn't the careful deflection she'd grown accustomed to. This was the complete truth, ugly and painful and devastating. 3 guards died during that robbery," Colt said. 3 men with families, with children who would grow up without fathers, and I could have prevented it with a single anonymous tip to the marshal. Eleanor sat in silence, processing the weight of what he'd told her. The man she'd fallen in love with wasn't just a former criminal. He was someone whose choices had directly contributed to the deaths of innocent people. "What happened after the robbery?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The gang split up, scattered to different territories. Jack McKenna was killed in a shootout with federal marshals 6 months later. The others were captured or killed one by one. I was the only one who escaped justice, probably because no one could believe a Harvard-trained physician would involve himself with train robbers." Colt returned to his cot, sitting heavily as if the weight of his confession had exhausted him. "I've spent the last 3 years trying to make amends, using my medical skills to help people who needed it, never charging for my services, trying to save more lives than my cowardice cost." Eleanor found herself thinking of Timothy Walsh, of her own stitched wound, of all the people Colt had helped during his travels. "Is that why you became a supplier, to have an excuse to travel and help people?" "Partly. And partly because I was running from who I used to be, trying to become someone I could live with." Colt looked at her with an expression of profound sadness. When I met you, when I saw how you were grieving and struggling, I wanted to help. But somewhere along the way, helping you became loving you. And loving you made me want to be worthy of that love." Eleanor felt tears threatening, but she pushed them back. "So you lied about your name, about your past, about everything that made you who you are." "I lied about the facts, but not about the feelings. Everything I told you about caring for you, about wanting to build something real, that was all true." The sincerity in his voice was almost painful to hear. Eleanor believed him about his feelings, could see the genuine remorse and love in his eyes. But she also couldn't ignore the magnitude of his deception, or the fact that he'd let her fall in love with him while hiding something this significant. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I face the consequences of my choices," Colt replied. "The marshal says they'll likely transport me to Colorado within the week. There will be a trial, and depending on what evidence they have, I'll either spend the rest of my life in prison or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood. The possibility of losing him permanently, either to prison or to the gallows, sent a spike of panic through her chest. Regardless of what he'd done, regardless of how he'd deceived her, the thought of a world without Colt in it felt unbearable. "There has to be something we can do," Eleanor said. "Some way to fight this." Colt shook his head sadly. "There's no fighting the truth, Eleanor. I did what they say I did. The only question is whether they can prove it." Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing the small space in front of his cell. Her mind was racing, trying to find some solution, some way to protect the man she loved despite everything. What if you testified against the gang members who are still alive? What if you cooperated with the authorities? There's no one left to testify against. They're all dead or already captured. Then what about all the good you've done since then? What about the lives you've saved? Colt's expression softened. "That's not how justice works, Eleanor. Good deeds don't erase past crimes." Eleanor stopped pacing and faced him directly. "Maybe not, but they should count for something. They should matter." That afternoon, Eleanor found herself in the most unlikely place, sitting across from Marshal Harrison in his office, trying to convince him that the man in his jail was worth saving. "Mrs. Hayes," the marshal said gently, "I understand your feelings for Dr. McKinnon, but the law is clear. He's wanted for serious felonies, and we have evidence linking him to those crimes." "What evidence?" Eleanor demanded. "Accusations on a wanted poster, testimony from other criminals trying to save their own skins." Marshal Harrison opened a file on his desk, pulling out several documents. "We have bank records showing payments made to Dr. McKinnon by known associates of the McKenna gang. We have witness testimony placing him at locations where the gang planned their robberies. And we have his own medical records showing treatment of gang members on dates that correspond with their criminal activities." Eleanor felt her heart sink. The evidence seemed overwhelming, painting a clear picture of Colt's involvement with the gang. "But you don't have any evidence that he participated directly in the robberies," Eleanor said, grasping for any hope. "You don't have proof that he knew about the Union Pacific job beforehand?" "No," the marshal admitted, "but conspiracy charges don't require direct participation. Providing aid and information to known criminals is enough for a conviction." Eleanor left the marshal's office feeling defeated, but not ready to give up. She spent the rest of the afternoon visiting townspeople, trying to gather support for Colt based on his actions since arriving in their community. She spoke to the Walsh family about how he'd saved their son, to others he'd helped with medical problems, even to some who had initially been suspicious of him. The responses were mixed. Some people were grateful for Colt's help and willing to speak on his behalf. Others felt betrayed by his deception and wanted nothing to do with defending a criminal. Most fell somewhere in between, unsure what to make of a man who had saved their children while hiding such a dark past. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen, staring at her teaching certificate, the document that represented her old life, her identity before Thomas, before grief, before Colt. She thought about Thomas's words about living versus surviving, about the choice between safety and love. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor carried the certificate to the fireplace and held it over the flames. This represented the woman she used to be, the one who played by all the rules, who never took risks, who let others make the important decisions in her life. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to love again despite the risks, someone who was willing to fight for what mattered, even when the odds seemed impossible. Eleanor dropped the certificate into the fire and watched it burn. Tomorrow, she would make a choice that would define who she really was. Not Thomas's widow, not the town's former schoolteacher, but Eleanor Hayes, a woman capable of deciding her own fate. The flames consumed the last traces of her old life, and Eleanor felt something settle inside her chest, a resolve born of love and loss, and the hard-won knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. Tomorrow, she would take a stand that would shock the entire community. Tomorrow, she would discover what she was truly capable of when someone she loved was in danger. But tonight, she mourned for the simple happiness that had been built on shifting ground, and prepared herself for the battle ahead. Eleanor woke to the sound of the church bell ringing, not the slow, measured tolls that marked the hour, but the rapid, insistent clanging that called the community together in times of crisis or important decision. She dressed quickly, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she was about to do something that would change everything, not just for herself and Colt, but for how this small frontier town understood justice and redemption. By the time she reached the church, nearly half the town had gathered inside the simple wooden building. Conversations died as Eleanor walked down the center aisle, her spine straight and her chin raised despite the whispers that followed in her wake. She could feel eyes on her, some sympathetic, some judgmental, all curious about what the widow, who had harbored a wanted criminal, might have to say. Reverend Morrison stood at the pulpit, his weathered face showing confusion about why his bell had been rung without his permission. Eleanor approached him directly, her voice carrying clearly, in the hushed space. "Reverend, I apologize for taking the liberty of calling this gathering, but I have something urgent to say to our community, something that concerns all of us." The Reverend studied her face, perhaps seeing something there that convinced him to step aside. "Very well, Mrs. Hayes, you have our attention." Eleanor moved to stand behind the pulpit, looking out at faces she'd known for years, people she'd taught their children, people who had supported her through Thomas's illness and death, people who now stared at her with expressions ranging from concern to disapproval. She saw Margaret Hendricks in the third pew, her face tight with worry. She saw the Walsh family, little Timothy's color fully restored after Colt's treatment. She saw Marshal Harrison standing at the back, his hand resting on his gun belt as if he expected trouble. "Friends," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "3 days ago, you learned that I had been sharing my home with a man wanted for serious crimes. Many of you feel I was foolish to trust him, and perhaps you're right, but I want to tell you what I've learned about justice, about redemption, and about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of mercy." A murmur ran through the congregation, but Eleanor pressed on. "Dr. Colton McKinnon, yes, that is his real name, is guilty of the crimes he's accused of. He has admitted this to me freely, without trying to minimize his actions or shift blame to others. 3 years ago, he made choices that contributed to the deaths of 3 innocent men, and he has carried that burden every day since." Sarah Jameson stood from her pew, her voice sharp with indignation. "Then why are you defending him if he's guilty?" "Because," Eleanor interrupted, her voice growing stronger, "guilt and redemption are not mutually exclusive. Because the man who made those terrible choices 3 years ago is not the same man who saved Timothy Walsh's life last week." She gestured toward the Walsh family, and Thomas Walsh slowly stood, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Hayes speaks the truth," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the church. Dr. McKinnon rode through a blizzard to reach our boy when no other help was available. He used skills and medicines that saved Timothy's life. If that man is a criminal, then I say some criminals are better than most honest men. Mary Walsh rose beside her husband. He wouldn't take payment for helping our son, said saving the boy was payment enough. That doesn't sound like the actions of a heartless outlaw to me. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for their support. But she knew she needed to address the larger question of justice that hung over the community. I'm not asking you to ignore Colton's crimes, she continued. I'm not asking you to pretend he didn't make terrible mistakes. But I am asking you to consider what justice really means. Is it simply punishment for past wrongs? Or is it also the opportunity for someone to make amends, to use their skills and knowledge to help rather than harm? James Patterson stood from his seat near the front, his face hard with disapproval. Mrs. Hayes, you're asking us to interfere with federal law. This man is wanted by authorities who have the right to try him for his crimes. I'm asking you to consider what our community values, Eleanor replied. Are we the kind of people who turn our backs on someone who has proven himself through his actions? Are we so afraid of what others might think that we can't recognize genuine goodness when we see it? She paused, looking around the room at faces that were beginning to show uncertainty rather than simple condemnation. Colton McKinnon came here as a stranger and asked for nothing more than shelter from a storm. In return, he helped maintain my property, saved a child's life, and brought medical care to anyone who needed it. He never asked for payment, never demanded recognition, never caused trouble for anyone in this community. Eleanor's voice grew passionate as she continued. How many of us can say we've used our talents as selflessly? How many of us have risked our own safety to help a stranger? How many of us have dedicated months of our lives to making amends for our past mistakes? Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Hayes, what exactly are you asking of us? Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would irrevocably change her standing in this community. I'm asking you to help me free him. The church erupted in shocked murmurs, and Marshal Harrison moved closer to the front, his hand now resting on his pistol grip. Mrs. Hayes, the marshal said firmly, you're talking about obstructing justice. That's a serious crime in itself. Eleanor turned to face him directly, her eyes blazing with determination. I'm talking about a higher justice, Marshal, the kind that recognizes redemption when it sees it. The law doesn't work that way, Marshal Harrison replied. I have a duty to uphold federal warrants, regardless of personal feelings. Then let me appeal to your personal feelings, Eleanor said, stepping down from the pulpit to face him directly. You've seen the evidence against Colton. You know he was involved with that gang. But you've also seen what he's become, what he's done with his life since then. Is there nothing in that transformation that speaks to your sense of justice? The marshal's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. I took an oath, Mrs. Hayes. I can't ignore that oath just because a criminal has done some good deeds. Eleanor nodded, having expected this response. She turned back to the congregation, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Then I'll make this simple. I'm going to help Colton escape with or without your support. I'm going to do it because I believe in redemption, because I believe people can change, and because I believe love is worth fighting for even when the odds seem impossible. The church fell silent, shocked by her bold declaration. Eleanor could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment and concern and fear that her words had stirred up. If any of you want to help me, she continued, I'll be grateful for your assistance. If you want to stop me, then you'll have to choose between your friendship with me and your fear of controversy. But understand this, I will not abandon someone I love simply because it's the safe thing to do. Margaret Hendricks stood slowly, her face pale but determined. Eleanor, think about what you're saying. Think about what this will cost you. I have thought about it, Eleanor replied. I've thought about very little else. And I've decided that some things are more important than safety, more important than reputation, more important than following rules that don't account for the complexity of human nature. She looked around the room one final time, meeting the eyes of people who had been her friends, her neighbors, her community for 12 years. My husband once told me that there's a difference between surviving and living. For months after his death, I was just surviving, going through the motions of life without really experiencing it. Colton changed that. He helped me remember what it felt like to be truly alive, to care about someone, to hope for a future beyond mere existence. Eleanor's voice grew soft, but no less determined. I won't go back to just surviving. I won't abandon someone who showed me how to live again, not when he needs me most. So I'm asking one final time, will any of you help me do what's right, even if it's not what's legal? The silence stretched on, heavy with uncertainty and fear. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding, knowing that the next few moments would determine not just Colton's fate, but the kind of person she would prove herself to be. Finally, Thomas Walsh stood again, his weathered face set with quiet determination. I'll help, he said simply. Any man who saved my boy's life deserves the chance to save his own. One by one, others began to stand. Mary Walsh, old Henrik Mueller, despite his wife's disapproving glare. The blacksmith, Jim Hartley. Even young Peter Morrison, the Reverend's son. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that this community, her community, was willing to risk everything to help a man they barely knew simply because they trusted her judgment and believed in the possibility of redemption. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, Eleanor saw Marshal Harrison's expression harden with resolve. The battle lines were drawn now, and she knew that what came next would test not only her courage, but the very bonds that held their small community together. The confrontation Eleanor had expected never came. Instead, as the crowd began to disperse from the church, Marshal Harrison approached her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part resignation, part something that might have been relief. Mrs. Hayes, he said quietly, I need to speak with you privately. Eleanor followed him outside, her heart racing with the assumption that he was about to arrest her for conspiracy. Instead, the marshal led her around to the side of the church, away from the lingering townspeople, and pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Before you do something that will ruin your life, he said, there's something you need to see. Eleanor took the document with trembling hands, recognizing it as official correspondence bearing federal seals. As she read, her world shifted once again, but this time towards something that felt like hope. I don't understand, she said, looking up at the marshal's weathered face. This says the charges against Colton have been dropped. How is that possible? Marshal Harrison's expression softened into something approaching sympathy. It arrived this morning, just before you rang that bell. Seems there's been a development in the McKenna gang case that changes everything. Eleanor read the document again, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. The federal warrant for Dr. Colton McKinnon had been officially withdrawn based on new evidence that had come to light during the trial of the gang's last surviving member. What kind of evidence? Eleanor asked. The kind that proves your Dr. McKinnon was working undercover for the federal marshals the entire time he was with the gang. Eleanor felt her knees go weak, and the marshal steadied her with a gentle hand. On her arm, I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes, I know this must be confusing after everything you've been through. Undercover, Eleanor repeated, struggling to process this revelation. You mean he was never really a criminal? Marshal Harrison guided her to sit on the church steps, clearly recognizing that she needed time to absorb this information. According to this report, Dr. McKinnon approached federal authorities after treating Jack McKenna's initial wounds. He offered to infiltrate the gang and provide intelligence about their activities in exchange for the opportunity to prevent future crimes. Eleanor stared at the document, reading the official language that described Colton not as a criminal, but as an undercover operative whose work had helped authorities track and eventually capture most of the McKenna gang. "But the train robbery," Eleanor said. "He told me he could have prevented it, but didn't. He said 3 men died because of his cowardice." The marshal's expression grew grim. According to his handler's report, Dr. McKinnon did try to warn authorities about the planned robbery. His message was delayed by a winter storm, and by the time it reached the proper officials, the robbery was already underway. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and pride. The man she had fallen in love with wasn't a reformed criminal carrying terrible guilt. He was a hero who had risked everything to stop a gang of murderers and thieves, and who had blamed himself for circumstances beyond his control. "Why wasn't this information available before?" Eleanor asked. "The marshal, who was Dr. McKinnon's handler, was killed in an unrelated incident 6 months ago. The records of his undercover operatives were misfiled during the transition to a new office. It's only been recently that they've been sorting through the paperwork and discovered the truth about Dr. McKinnon's real role." Eleanor stood slowly, her mind racing with the implications of this revelation. "So he's free. He can go back to practicing medicine." "More than that," Marshal Harrison said with a slight smile. "According to this commendation letter, Dr. McKinnon is being offered a position as a federal medical examiner, with full recognition of his service and contributions to law enforcement." Eleanor walked back toward the jail in a daze, the marshal beside her, her heart pounding with anticipation of seeing Colton's face when he learned the truth. She found him sitting on his cot, exactly as she'd left him that morning, his head in his hands, the picture of a man resigned to his fate. "Colton," she said softly, and when he looked up, she saw surprise flicker across his features. "Eleanor, what are you doing here? I thought after yesterday—" "I came to tell you that you're free," Eleanor interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "The charges have been dropped. You're not a criminal. You never were." Colton stared at her blankly, as if her words were in a foreign language he couldn't quite translate. "What are you talking about?" Marshal Harrison stepped forward, producing the key to the cell door. "Dr. McKinnon, it seems there's been a significant misunderstanding about your status with federal law enforcement. As the marshal explained about the recovered records and Colton's true role as an undercover operative, Eleanor watched a transformation take place in the man she loved. The weight of guilt and shame that had bowed his shoulders began to lift, replaced by something that might have been wonder. "You mean I didn't fail to warn them about the train robbery?" Colton asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did." "Oh, warn them," Marshal Harrison confirmed. "Your message was received, just not in time. The delay wasn't your fault, Dr. McKinnon. You did everything you could." Eleanor saw tears spring to Colton's eyes, 3 years of self-hatred and guilt washing away in the space of a single moment. When he looked at her, she saw not the haunted fugitive she'd been prepared to help escape, but the good man she'd always believed him to be, finally free to acknowledge his own worth. "Eleanor," he said, stepping out of the cell as a free man, "I'm so sorry for what I put you through. For the lies, for the deception—" "You weren't lying," Eleanor interrupted, moving into his arms without hesitation. "You were protecting an investigation, protecting people who might have been hurt if your real identity had been discovered. You were doing your duty." Colton held her tightly, his face buried in her hair. "I believed I was a coward," he whispered. "I believed I was responsible for those deaths. The guilt was eating me alive." "But you're not a coward," Eleanor said firmly. "You're a hero. You risked your life to stop a gang of killers. You've spent 3 years helping people, saving lives, making the world a better place. That's who you really are." When they finally broke apart, Eleanor saw something in Colton's eyes she'd never seen before. Peace. The careful guardedness was gone, replaced by the calm confidence of a man who no longer had to hide from his past. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. Marshal Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. Well, Dr. McKinnon, you have some choices to make. The federal government is offering you that position I mentioned, which would mean traveling to various territories as needed. Or you could return to private practice with a full pardon and recommendation from federal authorities. Colton looked at Eleanor, his grey eyes holding a question she could read as clearly as spoken words. "Where would you like to practice medicine?" Eleanor asked, her heart in her throat. "Here," Colton replied without hesitation. "If this community will have me, if you will have me." Eleanor felt joy bloom in her chest like spring flowers after a long winter. "I think that can be arranged, especially if you're willing to consider a partnership." "What kind of partnership?" Eleanor smiled, feeling bold and hopeful and alive in a way she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death. "The kind where you provide medical care and I provide education. The kind where we rebuild this community together, help it grow and thrive. The kind where we make something lasting and meaningful." Colton's smile was like sunrise after the darkest night. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do." As they walked out of the jail together, Eleanor saw the townspeople who had gathered to support her earlier still waiting in the street. When they saw Colton walking free, confusion rippled through the crowd until Marshal Harrison stepped forward to explain the situation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thomas Walsh was the first to approach, extending his hand to Colton with a broad grin. "Dr. McKinnon," he said, "I'd be honored to shake the hand of a man who serves his country and saved my boy's life." Others followed, people who had been suspicious of Colt, people who had defended him, people who were simply relieved to learn that their judgment of his character had been sound. Eleanor watched with pride as her community embraced the man she loved, welcoming him not as a stranger seeking shelter, but as one of their own. That evening, as they sat together by the fire in Eleanor's kitchen, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the grief that had nearly destroyed her, the winter storm that had brought Colt to her door, the slow building of trust and love, the devastating revelation of his supposed crimes, and now, finally, the truth that set them both free. "I have something for you," Colton said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden carving, the horse she'd seen him working on, and placed it gently in her hands. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, admiring the intricate details he'd captured in the smooth wood. "It's a wild Mustang," Colton explained, "free to run wherever the wind takes it. I carved it while I was thinking about what it might feel like to be truly free again." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing in his face the same peace she felt in her own heart. "And how does it feel?" Colton reached across the table and took her, hands in his. "Like coming home," he said simply, "like finding something I didn't even know I was looking for." Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him, tasting freedom and hope, and the promise of a future they could build together. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his and smiled. "Welcome home, Dr. McKinnon. Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Hayes." And in the warmth of her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the love they'd built, despite impossible odds, Eleanor knew that Thomas would have been proud of the choice she'd made. She had chosen to live rather than merely survive, to love rather than remain safely alone, to fight for what mattered rather than accept what seemed inevitable. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and rich with the promise. Of all the lives they would touch together, Eleanor had found her way through the winter, and spring, in all its forms, was finally coming home. Spring arrived early that year, as if the earth itself had grown weary of winter's long grip and chosen to embrace renewal with particular enthusiasm. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching as Colton directed the installation of the new bell they'd ordered from Denver, a bright bronze instrument whose clear tones would call children to learning and the community to celebration for generations to come. The schoolhouse had reopened in March, just 6 weeks after Colton's vindication, with 14 students instead of the 7 who had scattered the previous autumn. Word of the town's new doctor had spread through the territory, bringing families back to a community that now offered both education and medical care, luxuries that many frontier settlements could only dream of. "Mrs. McKinnon," came a small voice from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find little Timothy Walsh tugging at her skirt. She still felt a flutter of joy every time someone used her married name, though she and Colton had been wed for 2 months now, in a ceremony that the entire town had helped to plan. "Yes, Timothy? Dr. Colton says to tell you the bell's ready for testing. He wants to know if you'd like to ring it first." Eleanor smiled, smoothing the boy's unruly hair. Timothy had become something of a mascot for both the school and the medical practice, his complete recovery serving as a testament to Colton's skill and dedication. "Tell Dr. Colton I'll be right there." She gathered her shawl, the same one Thomas had brought her from Denver, but now worn with different memories, and stepped into the warm afternoon air. The past few months had transformed not just her life, but the entire character of their small settlement. Where once there had been the quiet desperation of a community in decline, now there was the bustling energy of growth and hope. Colton looked up as she approached, his face breaking into the easy smile that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. The careful guardedness was completely gone now, replaced by the open confidence of a man who no longer had anything to hide from himself or others. "Ready to make history?" he asked, offering her the rope that would ring the bell for the first time. Eleanor looked around at the faces gathered to witness this moment. Margaret Hendricks, who had become her closest friend and strongest supporter. The Walsh family, whose gratitude had never dimmed. Young couples with children who had moved to town specifically because of the school and medical practice. Even James Patterson, who had eventually admitted that his initial suspicions had been wrong. "Together," Eleanor said, placing her hands over Colton's on the rope. "We'll ring it together." The bell's first peal rang out clear and strong across the valley, its voice carrying the news of renewal to anyone within miles who cared to listen. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. After the small ceremony, Eleanor and Colton walked hand in hand back to their house, no longer just Eleanor's house but their home, filled with the comfortable accumulation of a shared life. The spare room that had once been intended as a nursery was now Colton's study, lined with medical texts and stocked with supplies for his practice. Thomas's workshop had become a place where both of them worked, Colton crafting medical instruments and Eleanor making teaching materials for her students. "I received a letter today," Colton said, as they settled on their front porch with glasses of sweet tea, a luxury they'd allowed themselves since his practice had begun bringing in steady income. "Good news, I hope?" Colton pulled the letter from his pocket, his expression thoughtful. "It's from the Federal Medical Examiner's Office. They're still interested in offering me that position." Eleanor felt a flicker of the old fear, the possibility of losing what they'd built together. "And how do you feel about that?" "Honored that they would consider me," Colton replied honestly. "It would be important work, helping to establish medical standards across the territories, but it would also mean extensive travel, long separations from you and this community." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the conflict there between professional ambition and personal contentment. "What does your heart tell you?" Colton was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the valley that had become their home. "My heart tells me that I've found something here that can't be replaced, a purpose that goes beyond career advancement, a life that feels complete." He turned to look at her directly, his grey eyes holding the warmth that had first attracted her during those long winter evenings by the fire. "I spent 3 years running from who I thought I was, trying to make amends for crimes I believed I'd committed. But you helped me understand that redemption isn't about punishing yourself for past mistakes. It's about choosing to build something better going forward." Eleanor reached for his hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. So what will you tell them? That I'm honored by their offer, but I've found my calling here. That there's more to healing than just treating illness. There's also building healthy communities, creating places where people can thrive instead of just survive. Eleanor felt her heart swell with pride and love. This was the man she'd seen. Glimpses of during that first winter, the one who had emerged fully when the weight of false guilt had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Speaking of building," Eleanor said, "I have some news of my own." Colton raised an eyebrow, noting something in her tone that suggested significance beyond casual conversation. Eleanor stood and walked to the railing of their porch, looking out at the garden they'd planted together. Vegetables and flowers mixed in a riot of practical beauty that reflected both their personalities. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Territorial Education Board visited the school yesterday while you were delivering the Morrison baby. And she was impressed enough with our little school to recommend it as a model for other frontier communities. She's asked me to write a curriculum guide that could be used throughout the territory. Colton joined her at the railing, his pride evident in his expression. "Eleanor, that's wonderful. You'd be influencing education across the entire region." "We'd be influencing it," Eleanor corrected. She specifically mentioned how impressed she was with the integration of basic medical education into the curriculum. She said the partnership between the school and the medical practice was exactly the kind of innovation the territory needs. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. Eleanor found herself thinking about the woman she'd been a year ago, lost in grief, isolated by circumstances, resigned to merely surviving until her own life came to its inevitable end. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she remembered, with compassion but could barely recognize as herself. "Do you ever think about Thomas?" Colton asked gently, sensing the direction of her thoughts. "Every day," Eleanor replied honestly, "but differently now. Before, thinking about him was like pressing on a wound that wouldn't heal. Now it's more like touching a treasured photograph, still precious but no longer painful." She turned to face her husband, this man who had taught her that love didn't have to end when someone died, but could instead make room for new love without diminishing the old. "I think he would like you," Eleanor said. "I think he would be happy that I found someone who makes me laugh again, who challenges me to grow, who sees possibilities where I see only problems." Colton's smile was soft and understanding. "I hope so. I'd like to think that somewhere, somehow, he knows you're happy." That evening, as they prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself pausing in front of the mirror in their bedroom, the same mirror where she'd studied her reflection the morning after Thomas's death, seeing only emptiness and loss. Now she saw something entirely different, a woman whose silver-touched hair spoke of wisdom earned through hardship, whose eyes held the calm confidence of someone who had faced the worst and emerged stronger, whose face showed the subtle glow that came from being truly cherished by another person. "What are you thinking about?" Colton asked, brushing his teeth at the washstand they now shared. "How different everything looks from this side of healing," Eleanor replied. "A year ago, I thought my life was essentially over. I thought the best I could hope for was to endure until the end. Now, Eleanor turned from the mirror and moved into her husband's arms, feeling the solid warmth of him, breathing in the scent that had become home to her. "Now I feel like everything is just beginning." Colton held her close, and Eleanor could feel his contentment in the steady rhythm of his breathing, the relaxed strength of his embrace. They had both traveled such long distances to reach this moment, he from guilt and self-hatred, she from grief and isolation, but somehow they had found each other exactly when they both needed healing most. As they settled into bed together, Eleanor listened to the sound of wind in the cottonwood tree outside their window. The same tree Thomas had planted, now grown tall and strong, its branches reaching toward stars that seemed brighter somehow than they had during those dark months of winter. "Colton," she said softly. "Thank you." "For what?" Eleanor considered all the ways he had changed her life, all the gifts he had brought beyond simple companionship. He had shown her that love could bloom again after devastating loss. He had taught her that healing was possible even when wounds seemed too deep to mend. He had helped her discover strength she hadn't known she possessed, and courage she'd never thought to need. "For helping me remember how to live," she said finally. "Thank you for teaching me that I deserve to," Colton replied. Outside their window, the night was full of the sounds of spring, new life stirring, winter's grip finally broken, the eternal cycle of renewal that promised hope even in the darkest seasons. Eleanor drifted towards sleep, thinking about the future they would build together, the lives they would touch, the love they would share, and the community they would help flourish. She had kept her promise to Thomas, after all. She had found her way through the winter, and she had chosen to live rather than merely survive. The difference, she now understood, was love. Not just romantic love, though that had been the catalyst, but love for community, love for purpose, love for the simple miracle of each new day and the possibilities it held. Tomorrow would bring new students to teach, new patients to heal, new challenges to face together. But tonight, Eleanor Hayes McKinnon slept peacefully in the arms of the man who had helped her find her way home to herself, dreaming of spring and second chances and all the beautiful complications that came with choosing to embrace life fully. Whatever surprises it might hold, the story that had begun with winter's arrival ended with spring's promise, but Eleanor knew it was really just the beginning of a larger story, one that would be written day by day, choice by choice, in the shared life she and Colton would build together in the years to come.